The debris field at Tessavaan Drift extended for 900 kilometers in every direction, and not one piece of it was human. Survey Commander Sarath Alden had worked wreck sites for 11 years, had catalogued the aftermath of 3 fleet engagements and 1 station implosion, and the first thing that told her something extraordinary had happened at Tessavaan was not the scale of the carnage. It was the geometry. Wreck fields have a natural scatter pattern, a chaotic spray that speaks to the moment of destruction, the forces applied, the vector of the ships when they broke. This field had sectors. Clean zones of concentrated wreckage alternating with stretches of empty drift, as though something very large and very methodical had moved through the Caelari sovereignties. Second grand reclamation, fleet the way a blade moves through grain, not frantic, not explosive, just thorough. The thoroughness was the thing, the specific, organized thoroughness of it. The survey vessel ISV unfinished record held position at the field's western boundary and sent out its drones. 17 of them, fanning into the debris on pre-plotted courses, their hull memory sniffer arrays active, their spectrographic sensors tasting the cold metal residue of what had been, 31 days ago, the most powerful fleet the Caelari sovereignty had ever assembled for a single operation. Alden stood at the main display table and read the early returns. 2,347 confirmed Caelari warship hulls, destroyed or hulked. Another 211 confirmed escaped via jump trace. She could follow the FTL ghost signatures outbound, most of them heading for Caelari home space at emergency velocities that suggested crews who would not stop until they were very far away. That left 42 ships of the original 2,600 unaccounted for. Her analysis subprogram would find them in the debris eventually. It always did. What she was looking for was not the Caelari wreckage. She was looking for what had done this to them. "Contact," said sensor operator Vendale, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to show excitement at a wreck site. "Grid reference Kappa 7. Single hull, 4 kilometers length, cold running. IFF confirms Terran Meridian Fleet Sentinel-class dreadnought. Registry tag reads INS Irreversible." Alden found it on the display. It sat in the middle of the field like a king in its own court, surrounded by the broken debris of what it had apparently faced. The Irreversible was not a pristine ship. She could see impact scoring, buckled plating along the starboard secondary battery housing, 2 of its 8 main engine clusters dark. But the hull was intact. The ship existed. It had come through. 11 Terran hulls had not, but the dreadnought had. She needed to understand what had happened here. That was why she had come, why the Meridian Fleet Historical Oversight Office had dispatched a survey vessel rather than simply accepting the fleet's after-action report. The after-action report had been submitted by Fleet Admiral Khan Vrosh 14 days after the engagement, and it had read like a document written by a man who had not yet processed what he had survived. The numbers were there. The tactical sequence was there. But the document had a strange, hollowed-out quality, as though the man filing it could not quite bring himself to use language that matched the scale of what had occurred. Alden had been told to go to Tessavaan and make the record, so she had. She began with the hull memory cores. The cores were dense crystalline storage units embedded in Caelari hulls, designed to record everything a ship's sensor suite perceived. They were not meant to survive the destruction of their ship. They were not hardened the way Terran black boxes were, but they were built into armored command sections, and enough command sections had survived largely intact that Alden's drones recovered 43 functional Caelari cores over the next 16 hours. She also pulled 9 Terran data buoys from the field, the automatic launch units that every Meridian fleet ship expelled when it anticipated catastrophic damage. They were designed to drift and transmit. She sat with her team in the survey vessel's analysis bay and began building a picture of what had happened on the 14th day of the 3rd month, at the Tessavaan Drift, where the Caelari sovereignty's 2nd Grand Reclamation Fleet had come to eliminate Meridian Station and its 37,000 inhabitants, and where something had arrived instead. The The Caelari account began 3 hours before the engagement. Alden listened to the core playback through a translation matrix. The Caelari sensor logs rendered into a flat synthetic voice that still managed to convey the growing unease in the original records. The Sovereignty's second Grand Reclamation Fleet had been assembled with meticulous care over 18 months. Fleet Sovereign Caelith Dorn had personally overseen its composition. 2,600 hulls, ranging from escort frigates of 20,000-ton displacement to the 4 Eminence-class capital ships that formed the fleet's armored core, each one a vessel the size of a human space station. The fleet had one task: arrive at Tessavaan Drift, transit the 12 light-minute gap to Meridian Station, and eliminate the human installation that had been quietly operating in what the Sovereignty considered its sovereign space for the past 9 years. They had planned it carefully. They had verified, through intelligence channels, that the Meridian Sector's permanent fleet garrison was currently deployed to Sector 8 in response to a piracy outbreak. They had confirmed that Meridian Station's defensive complement consisted of 6 aging patrol cruisers and a mine perimeter. They had calculated the operation would require approximately 40 minutes from transit arrival to completion. Fleet Sovereign Dorn's pre-engagement log entry, recovered from a command section that had survived largely intact, showed a commander satisfied with his planning. The numbers favored the Sovereignty overwhelmingly. The station would be warned to evacuate. The Sovereignty was not, in its own estimation, barbaric, but the evacuation window would be 11 minutes, which was insufficient for the station's population to reach safety, and this was calculated rather than accidental. Meridian Station's existence was an assertion of Terran claim to Caelari space. Its removal was meant to be a lesson. The 11-minute window was the lesson's punctuation mark. What Fleet Sovereign Dorn's pre-engagement log did not contain was any awareness that 3 days earlier, the 14th Terran Meridian Fleet 84 ships, including the Sentinel-class dreadnought INS Irreversible, 18 Rampart-class heavy cruisers, 31 Iron Gate-class destroyers, and 34 mixed escort vessels, had been conducting deep space navigation trials 11 light towers from Tessavaan. Specifically, transit drive cascade trials. The technical literature on the failure mode was dry, and Alden had read it twice. Under certain resonance conditions, when multiple transit drives engaged simultaneously in close formation, the drives could achieve a coupled resonance state that produced what the engineering teams called a cascade inversion. Instead of translating the fleet to its planned coordinates, the coupled field inverted its vector, translating the fleet to a point determined by the combined gravity signature of the nearest large mass concentration. The nearest large mass concentration to the 14th Meridian Fleet's trial coordinates, at the moment of cascade inversion, was the Tessavaan Drift itself. Specifically, the combined gravitational signature of 2,600 Caelari warships holding position in close formation. The 14th Meridian Fleet arrived at Tessavaan Drift 11 minutes before Fleet Sovereign Dorn had planned to transit to Meridian Station. From the Caelari sensor cores, Alden could reconstruct the exact moment the Sovereignty's fleet registered the new contacts. The anomaly flag appeared in their network at 14:07:33 local transit time. It propagated through the Caelari fleet's sensor grid in approximately 4 seconds, the time it took the cascade inversion's residual energy signature to register on enough hull sensors for the network to confirm it was an instrument error. At 14:07:37, Fleet Sovereign Dorn's own command core recorded his personal acknowledgement of the anomaly flag. At 14:07:41, the flag was reclassified as confirmed contact, 84 new drive signatures appearing simultaneously at bearing 330 Mark 12, range 16,000 kilometers. 16,000 kilometers, for a fleet of 2,600 warships, was what a human gunner would call point-blank range. The Caelari fleet had not yet processed what it was looking at. Their archives, Alden knew from prior research, contained extensive documentation on the Meridian Sector patrol forces. They knew the 6 aging patrol cruisers. They had no entry for the 14th Meridian Fleet. It was a deep space operational force, not a sector garrison, and it had never operated in this region. Their identification protocols were checking the new contacts against known Terran configurations and returning increasingly uncertain results. The Irreversible, at 4 kilometers length, was simply not in their records. The Caelari Archive's largest recorded Terran vessel was 2 kilometers. The Irreversible was twice that, and it was surrounded by 83 other ships that were themselves larger than anything the Sovereignty had faced before. This moment, the 16 seconds between confirmed contact and Fleet Sovereign Dorn's first tactical order, was the moment that Alden's team returned to again and again. It was, in retrospect, the moment that determined everything else. The Caelari fleet had arrived at Tessavaan to deliver a lesson. They had not arrived prepared to fight. Their formation was a transit formation, not a combat formation, ships arrayed for sequential drive engagement, not for weapon coverage. Their weapon systems were in standby state. Their shields, which required 40 seconds to reach combat effective density, were in passive mode. They were, in every sense that mattered, a fleet that had not yet become a fighting force. The 14th Meridian Fleet, which had just experienced a drive cascade inversion that had flung it 11 light towers off course without warning, was, by the nature of what it was, always a fighting force. The cascade inversion had automatically triggered every Terran ship's combat protocols. Their weapons were live. Their shields were up, compensating for the transit stress. Their sensors had already swept the contact field and were delivering detailed analysis to every tactical officer in the fleet. Fleet Admiral Khan Vrash's data buoy recovered and transmitted before his flagship took a strike to its forward section, recorded his first order at 14:07:49, 8 seconds after confirmed contact. It was a single word. Report. His tactical officer's response took 4 seconds. By the time it was delivered, the Irreversible's targeting systems had already sorted the 2,600 Caelari contacts by hull displacement, weapon signature, and threat priority, had identified the 4 Eminence-class capital ships as primary targets, and had handed firing solutions to 17 different weapon stations. At 14:07:55, Fleet Admiral Vrash said, "All batteries prioritize capital ships. Coordinate with group commanders. Don't wait for orders." That was the entirety of his tactical briefing. The Corps recovered from the Caelari escort frigate immutable doctrine of the sovereign will was one of the 43 that Alden's drones pulled from the field, and it told a story that the broader strategic picture could not. The immutable doctrine had been positioned in the fleet's 7th transit ring, nearly 13,000 kilometers from the Terran emergence point, far enough that the engagement's first salvos were not directed at it. Its sensor operator, whose identification Alden's team rendered as Sub-Monitor Dale Chris Veen, had been conducting a routine calibration check on the passive array when the anomaly flag arrived. Alden listened to the Corps log for 6 minutes before she called her team together. What she heard in the Sub-Monitor's sensor entries was not the impersonal time-stamped record of a ship engaged in battle. It was something closer to a document of mounting incomprehension. At 14:07:41, Veen logged the contact flag as received with a notation: "Identification protocols running. Contacts do not match known Terran registry." At 14:07:58, the first rounds from the Irreversible's main battery crossed the engagement space and struck the nearest Eminence-class capital ship. The immutable doctrine's passive array registered the energy discharge, an order of magnitude larger than anything in its threat library, and Veen's log entry for that second was a single phrase: "Classification error suspected. Rerunning diagnostic." There was no classification error. The immutable doctrine's sensors were functioning correctly. They had simply encountered something they had no framework to describe. At 14:08, 14:01, the first capital ship ceased registering on any sensor. The log entry read, "Target Sovereign Prime has vanished from all arrays. Secondary thermal reading at coordinates consistent with drive core loss." The entry ended there. Whatever Veen had intended to add to it had been interrupted by the next sensor event demanding attention. Over the following 4 minutes, the immutable doctrine's logs showed a sensor operator working methodically through a situation that was dismantling the assumptions underlying every classification system available to her. At 14:09:14 she logged, "Contact designation 57, Terran Rampart class, has destroyed 3 escort-tier hulls in 40 seconds. Recommend reclassification to heavy threat category." At 14:09:22 she updated the entry, "Recommend reclassification of all Terran contacts to heavy threat category." At 14:09:31 she added, "Threat library requires updating. Current library does not contain adequate designations." The immutable doctrine survived the engagement. It was one of the 211 ships that executed Fleet Sovereign Dorn's jump order. Its core recorded the moment of jump at 14:22:44, 17 seconds after the retreat order was issued, which suggested that its crew had moved with considerable speed. The last entry Veen made before the jump was terse: "Formation status unknown. Command ships non-responsive. Executing jump on discretion." She had logged her own name at the end, which was not standard protocol. Alden's translation team noted it without comment. It was the kind of thing a person did when they were not confident they would have another opportunity to put their name on the record. Another core, recovered from what had been a Caelari heavy cruiser designated in the fleet roster as Certainty in the Sovereign's purpose, told a different story. The Certainty had been positioned in the fleet's third transit ring, close enough to the Terran emergence point that it had been among the first non-capital ships engaged. Its command core was damaged. The first 40 seconds of the engagement were corrupted, but from 14:08:40 onward, the record was intact. What the Certainty's core showed was a crew that had recovered faster than most. Its weapons officer, a senior arms director whose designation translated roughly as Caelvethmore, had her batteries live at 14:08:52, and at 14:09:04 she had managed to place a coordinated salvo on an Iron Gate-class Terran destroyer that was working through the inner formation rings. The destroyer took damage. Alden could verify this against the 14th Fleet's casualty log. One Iron Gate-class, the INS Certain Distance, had sustained significant shield and plating damage at approximately that timestamp and grid reference. It had not been destroyed, but it had been driven off its attack course. The Certainty's core then showed something that Alden found herself returning to several times: a log entry from the ship's fleet captain, recorded between one tactical order and the next at 14:09:31. It read, "They are not stopping. This is not a patrol action. Whatever these ships are, they have not paused since they arrived." The entry was 60 words in Caelari, and Alden's translation matrix rendered it as flat and mechanical as everything else. But the content was unmistakably that of a commander reassessing a fundamental premise in the middle of an engagement. The Certainty was destroyed at 14:07. 3 Iron Gate-class destroyers had tagged it as a priority target after its weapons fire on the Certain Distance. The core survived in a forward command section that the drones found 11 days after the survey began, listed as artifact recovered, location grid reference Lambda 12. The fleet captain had made no further log entries after 14:09:31. He had been too busy commanding his ship. Alden compiled 14 such reconstructions from Caelari cores before she felt she had an adequate sample. What they showed, collectively, was not panic. The Sovereignty's crews were professional. They responded, adapted, and in many cases fought with real skill once they overcame the initial shock of the engagement's opening seconds. What the cores showed was the specific texture of a force that had arrived expecting to perform a predetermined task and found instead a problem it had not prepared for, in conditions that removed the tools it would normally use to compensate. The preparation was the tragedy of it. They had prepared for everything that was realistic to prepare for. Tessavaan was not realistic. The Caelari Corps told the story from the inside of a formation that had suddenly found itself in a situation its commanders had not planned for and could not quickly adapt to. The sovereignty's command doctrine relied on coordinated fire concentration. Their tactical thinking was built around the assumption that engagements would begin at extreme range, that there would be time for formation adjustment, for fire solution coordination, for the ordered exchange of sensor data that allowed their fleet to function as a unified weapon. At 16,000 kilometers, against a force that had already designated targets and begun firing, none of that doctrine was available to them. What the Corps showed, from ship after ship across the field, was a sequence that Alden's analysis team began quietly calling the deconstruction. The Irreversible's main battery opened at 14:07:58, 3 seconds after Vrash's order. Its railgun arrays, 42 primary weapons, each accelerating a penetrator round at a fraction under 3% of light speed, fired their first coordinated salvo at the nearest Eminence-class capital ship at a range of 15,800 kilometers. The Eminence-class capital ship's shields were at 40% density. A penetrator round at 3% of light speed does not require that its target's shields be low. It requires only that there be a target. The first Caelari capital ship began coming apart at 14:08:01. The Caelari Corps recovered from a frigate 700 kilometers away, recorded the event as a gravity wave anomaly followed by a thermal signature 32 times higher than a capital ship's normal drive output. The frigate's sensor operator logged a flag possible catastrophic drive failure in Target 1, and then updated the log 2 seconds later to note that Target 1 was no longer registering on any sensor. The second Eminence-class ship attempted to fire. It managed one salvo from its forward batteries before 3 of the 14th Meridian Fleet's Rampart-class cruisers, acting without explicit coordination, found it simultaneously. Their targeting computers had been running on the same threat priority list. They had independently designated the same target. Their fire converged at 14:08:14. The third Eminence-class ship began an emergency transit drive spool, attempting to jump out of engagement range. The transit drive required 90 seconds to reach jump-capable state. In 90 seconds at Tessavaan, many things happened. The third Eminence-class ship did not complete its jump. The fourth Eminence-class ship executed a radical heading change, attempting to open range and buy time. Fleet Admiral Vrash's combat AI, monitoring the engagement space, flagged the maneuver and allocated 3 Iron Gate-class destroyers to intercept. They were faster than the capital ship. They reached firing range before it reached any meaningful distance. By 14:10, 32 minutes and 32 seconds after the Irreversible's main battery opened, all 4 Caelari capital ships were destroyed or mission killed. The Caelari fleet still had 2,596 warships. What it did not have was a command structure. Fleet Sovereign Dorn's Corps recorded him issuing a general formation order at 14:09:45, attempting to collapse the transit formation into a combat sphere, the Sovereignty's standard defensive posture for ambush scenarios. The order was logged. Alden found no evidence it was executed, because executing it required the fleet's sensor network to coordinate formation geometry for 2,596 ships simultaneously, and the sensor network was dealing with something it was not designed to handle. The 14th Meridian Fleet had 84 ships. Every one of them was firing. They were not firing in organized salvos. They were firing as their targeting computers found solutions, which meant the Caelari fleet's sensor network was tracking hundreds of inbound rounds per second from multiple vectors, simultaneously processing thousands of targeting radar pings, and attempting to coordinate formation geometry for 2,596 ships that were themselves trying to interpret command orders, status their weapons, and raise their shields. The network was not overwhelmed in the sense of being flooded. It was overwhelmed in the sense of being asked to do things that required it to be faster than it was. Alden sat in her analysis bay on the 5th day and tried to put numbers to it. The 14th Meridian Fleet's combined weapon output, calculated from energy signatures preserved in the sensor cores, was approximately 940 weapon discharges per minute during the peak engagement period. Against a fleet of 2,600 ships, that was not an overwhelming ratio, roughly 1 discharge per 2.7 ships per minute. Enough to cause damage, but not, by any conventional model, enough to destroy a fleet of that size in 33 minutes. The models were wrong because they assumed a fleet could absorb and distribute that rate of fire the way a healthy formation could. A healthy formation had time to adjust, to redirect shields, to identify the pattern in the incoming fire and compensate. The Caelari fleet at Tessavaan did not have those things. It was in a transit formation, in standby posture, when 940 rounds per minute began arriving from 84 sources spread across a 16,000-kilometer sphere. The first Caelari ships to die were the ones nearest to the Meridian Fleet's emergence point. They died in the first 90 seconds, before the fleet around them could react. Their deaths removed the ships that would have formed the closest defensive ring. The next ring of ships inherited a threat environment that had grown more severe by the time they began to respond. The shield charge that was 40% complete when the engagement began was, for most Caelari ships, still not complete when the first rounds arrived. The cores showed a pattern that Alden's analytical lead, Technician Moravel, described with uncharacteristic bluntness. Each ship that died made the situation slightly worse for every ship around it. Not because of debris or secondary explosions, though those existed. Because each dead ship was a gap in the formation through which Terran targeting sensors could see deeper into the mass of the fleet, designating targets that would otherwise have been shielded by the formation's density. The Meridian Fleet's targeting computers were, apparently, very good at finding those gaps. The 14th Meridian Fleet had 84 ships, and they did not all fight the same way. Alden's reconstruction work, once it extended into the Terran data buoys, and the fragments of the fleet's own engagement logs she had obtained through the Historical Oversight Office, showed a force that was coherent without being choreographed. Each ship had its own captain, its own targeting priorities, its own read of the engagement space. What unified them was not a single directing intelligence issuing moment-by-moment orders. It was something more difficult to document, a shared understanding of what they were doing and why, precise enough that 84 individual commanders could each make independent decisions, and find, in the aggregate, that those decisions interlocked. The INS Resolute Meridian was a Rampart-class heavy cruiser, one of 18 in the fleet, positioned on the 14th's port formation edge at the moment of cascade inversion. Its captain was a commander named Tail Oris who had, according to her personnel file, never been in a fleet engagement. She had trained for 11 years. She had run exercises against simulated opponent arrays of up to 800 contacts. Nothing in her training had presented her with 2,600 real warships at 16,000 kilometers. Her data buoy, recovered in the field's northern sector, showed that Oris had designated her first target within 6 seconds of Rosh's order. She had not selected one of the capital ships, those were already being assigned by the fleet's priority sorting network, and she could see that the allocation was running correctly without her intervention. Instead, she had designated a cluster of Caelari heavy cruisers that were beginning to maneuver toward the Meridian Fleet's formation edge, apparently attempting to envelope the smaller Terran force. They were not yet in firing position. Oris had assessed that they would be in firing position within 4 minutes if she did not address them. The Resolute Meridian spent the engagement's first 14 minutes working systematically through that cruiser cluster. It destroyed 6. It drove off 3 more with damage that forced them out of their envelopment track. It took 2 hits in return, one that scorched its forward deck plating and one that took out a secondary battery, and wounded 4 crew members. At 14:22:00, 2 minutes before Fleet Sovereign Dorn issued his retreat order, the envelopment attempt had been fully disrupted. Oris filed a 2-sentence note in her buoy log at that timestamp: Northern Formation Edge Secure, redirecting to inner field support. She had redirected for 8 more minutes before the retreat order propagated through the remaining Caelari ships, and the engagement effectively concluded. The INS Warden's Commitment was an Iron Gate-class destroyer, one of the smallest hulls in the 14th's order of battle, 240 meters length and a crew of 91. Its captain, Lieutenant Commander Pel Akafer, was 29 years old. The Warden's Commitment was the last Terran ship to have fired during the engagement. Its log showed weapons discharge at 14:41:29, 4 seconds before the engagement clock stopped. The target was a Caelari frigate that had continued fighting after the retreat order, apparently because the frigate's own communications had been damaged and it had not received the command. Akafer had noted this in his log. Target appears to have not received the retreat signal, recommending non-lethal disable if possible. 2 seconds later he had updated: non-lethal disable not possible at current range and relative velocity. Standard engagement. The frigate had ceased functioning at 14:41:33. Akafer's buoy also contained a detail that did not appear in any other record Alden reviewed. At 14:09:17, 11 minutes into the engagement, the Warden's Commitment had passed through a debris field generated by the destruction of 2 Caelari escorts. Its sensors had registered, amid the wreckage, survival pods. Multiple Caelari survival pods, broadcasting distress signals on emergency bands. Akafer had logged his response: survival pods noted at grid reference Kappa 11, broadcasting position. We are unable to render assistance during active engagement. Will advise SAR teams post-engagement. He had then continued fighting. After the engagement, the Warden's Commitment had returned to Kappa 11. It spent 4 hours pulling survival pods. The log noted 43 Caelari crew members recovered, 6 deceased on recovery, 37 transferred to the Irreversible's medical facilities. Akafer had filed a separate addendum to his buoy specifically requesting that the survey team retrieve and preserve those pods as part of the record. There were people in them, the addendum read, and what happened to those people is also part of what happened here. Alden found the pods. She had them preserved. She noted the addendum in her primary record. Of the 11 Terran ships lost at Tessavaan, 4 were destroyers, 4 were escort vessels, 2 were Rampart-class cruisers, and 1 was the Iron Gate-class INS Perpetual Standard. The Perpetual Standard had been destroyed at 14:18:44, 25 minutes into the engagement, by concentrated fire from a Caelari frigate group that had achieved something that very few Caelari units managed in the whole of the battle. They had coordinated. 7 frigates had identified a single Terran destroyer, held their fire until 4 of them had clear solutions simultaneously, and then fired in a concentrated burst that overwhelmed the Perpetual Standard's shields before they could rebuild. The destroyer's data buoy had launched at 14:18:39, 5 seconds before the kill. It recorded the captain's last log entry: "We're taking concentrated fire from 7 contacts at close range. Shields failing. This is Captain Aren Soam, INS Perpetual Standard. Crew has performed with distinction." The buoy had drifted for 19 days before Alden's drones found it. She had read the entry twice, then passed it to the ship's crew for transcription into the memorial record she was building alongside the tactical one. At 14:22:00, Fleet Admiral Vrash had issued a fleet-wide order: disengage and render aid. The combat AI had continued tracking any Caelari ship still showing active weapon signatures. 3 of the fleet's destroyers had remained on intercept duties until 14:41:33, but the bulk of the 14th Meridian Fleet had shifted from combat operations to damage control and casualty assessment. The efficiency of this transition, from a force of 84 ships simultaneously executing a battle, and then pivoting to support operations without a single coordination failure, was, Alden thought, almost as remarkable as the battle itself. At 14:22:00, 14 minutes and 2 seconds after the Irreversible fired its first salvo, Fleet Sovereign Dorn issued an order to retreat. Alden found 6 cores from ships near the fleet's command center that had recorded this order. She listened to it 3 times through the translation matrix. The Fleet Sovereign's voice, rendered in flat synthetic tone, still managed to communicate the quality of a man who had just looked at a situation he could not fix and made the only decision remaining to him. 211 ships executed the jump order. They were the ones whose drive systems were still functional and whose crews were still present and coherent enough to execute a complex maneuver under fire. Alden tracked their FTL Ghost signatures outbound and noted that they had departed at emergency velocities on divergent headings. They were not retreating together. They were scattering. The jump order had broken whatever remained of the fleet's coordination, and 211 ships had departed individually, each one heading for what it calculated was the fastest route out of range. The remaining ships continued to fight, some of them quite effectively. Alden found cores that showed coordinated frigate groups bracketing Meridian fleet destroyers, managing to put meaningful fire on Terran shields. 3 of the 11 Terran ships lost in the engagement were destroyed in this later phase by Caelari units that had resolved to fight rather than run. She noted this without any particular judgment. They had been caught wrong-footed at the start, and they had fought well once they had recovered themselves. It simply had not been enough. The engagement effectively concluded at 14:41, 33 minutes and 35 seconds from first fire. The final Caelari warship still actively shooting ceased fire at that timestamp, either destroyed or disabled. The drift afterward was occupied by the sound of the Irreversible's damage control teams working, and the silence of a battlefield that had finished being a battlefield. 37,000 people on Meridian Station had watched it on their sensor arrays from 12 light-minutes away, helpless and unable to understand what they were seeing until it was over. On the 4th day of the survey, Alden received a transmission from Meridian Station. Station Commander Relth Odin had sent a recorded message because, his preamble explained, he had been trying to write a formal report of what he had observed for 2 weeks, and had found that he could not write it in report format. He was sending his observations as a personal account for her to use however she judged appropriate. The station's sensor lead had been a civilian contractor named Kes Voren, 18 years of passive monitoring experience. When the Sovereignty's fleet arrived at Tessavaan, 12 light-minutes away, visible on long-range passive sensors as a tightly packed mass of drive signatures, she had logged it, flagged it as a confirmed hostile formation, and relayed to Commander Odin the assessment that the station had perhaps 45 minutes before the fleet transited into direct engagement range. 45 minutes was not enough time to evacuate 37,000 people in any meaningful number. Odin had made the calculations when he received the flag. He had then done the thing that commanders in impossible situations have always done. He had begun the evacuation anyway, because doing something was the only alternative to doing nothing. The 6 patrol cruisers had formed up on the station's approach corridor. Their commanders had known their firepower was insufficient to contest a 2,600 ship fleet. They had formed up anyway. Voren had been watching the Caelari formation's drive signatures on the passive array when the cascade inversion happened. At 14:07, 41 station time, accounting for the 12 light-minute delay, she had watched 84 new contacts appear simultaneously in the middle of the Caelari formation. She had spent 45 seconds staring at the readout before she said anything. In that 45 seconds, she had run 3 separate diagnostic checks on her sensor array because the readout was not making sense, and sensor equipment that produces readings that do not make sense is usually malfunctioning. The sensor array was not malfunctioning. I asked her later what she thought when she confirmed it was real, Commander Odin said in the recording. She told me she thought, someone has made a very serious mistake. Then she said, but not us. Over the next 33 minutes, the station's passive sensors had watched the Caelari formation, a mass of 2,600 drive signatures that had registered as a unified dense object from 12 light-minutes away begin to come apart. Individual signatures blinking out, the mass losing coherence, thinning at the edges, then in the middle. The FTL ghost trails of the fleeing ships radiating outward in all directions like the spokes of a wheel whose hub had been broken. The station's civilian population had not been told what was happening until it was clearly over. Odin had ordered communications lockdown during the engagement. He did not want to create a panic on the basis of a developing situation whose outcome he could not predict. He had sat in the command center and watched the readings with Vorin and two other operators and said very little. When the last Caelari drive signatures went dark or fled, and the position at Tessavaan showed 84 Terran contacts still present and steady, Vorin had released a breath she had apparently been holding for several minutes. That's the Meridian fleet, the 14th. I know, Odin had said. They're 12 light-minutes away. They shouldn't be at Tessavaan. The 14th is supposed to be on navigation trials in Sector 6. I know. In the recording, Odin paused before continuing. I found later, when I read the engagement reconstruction, that the 14th Meridian Fleet had arrived there by drive malfunction. I read that report 3 times. It still strikes me as the wrong word for what the outcome was. Malfunction implies something failing. What happened at Tessavaan was that a fleet built to be ready found itself in front of something that needed to be stopped, and it stopped it. That the transit drive's failure was the mechanism that placed them there feels like a secondary detail when I look at what they did after arriving. Among the 37,000 on Meridian Station, there were those who had known, and those who had not. Alden requested supplementary accounts from Commander Odin's office and received, over the following 2 days, 11 recorded testimonies from station residents, crew, and contracted workers who had been present during the engagement window. The account she found herself reading most carefully was that of a civilian tug operator named Brem Sale. Sale ran a 12-person cargo hauler, the Perseverant option, contracted to Meridian Station for ore transfer operations in the outer belt. He had been returning from a belt run, roughly 4 light seconds from the station, when the communications lockdown had come into effect. His regular traffic control updates had stopped. His docking coordinator had gone quiet. He had queried the station twice and received only automated acknowledgement tones. He had not known about the Caelari fleet. His tug's passive sensors were not sophisticated enough to read Tessavaan's drive signatures at 12 light minutes. He had known only that the station had gone quiet, which in his experience meant something was being handled at a level above his clearance, which usually meant either a diplomatic situation or a security incident, and in either case the standard procedure was to hold position and wait. Sale had held position for 39 minutes. He had made a pot of something hot from his galley, stood in his cockpit looking at the unremarkable stars around him, and waited. He had made no log entries during this period. He told Odin's interviewer that he had thought about his crew. 7 of them were on the hauler with him, and the other 5 were back at the station on rotation. And he had thought about a supply delivery he was supposed to have made the previous week that had been delayed by a parts shortage, and he had thought about whether he would have time to get the tug's secondary docking clamps serviced before his next belt run. When the communications lockdown ended, Sale had received a station-wide broadcast from Commander Odin. He had listened to it in his cockpit, standing, looking out at the same unremarkable stars. The broadcast had explained briefly what had happened. It had used the phrase Meridian Fleet Intervention, which had not meant much to Sale in the moment. What had meant something to him was the phrase, "All persons aboard Meridian Station are safe." He had gone back to his galley and stood there for a while. Then he had returned to his cockpit and put in the docking request. On the final approach to the station, He had an unobstructed view of the Tessavaan coordinates on his navigation display, 12 light minutes out. There was nothing to see there from this distance, of course. It was just a number on a screen. He had looked at it for a while anyway. His account, read alongside the tactical records, was to Alden the most complete illustration of what the engagement had actually meant in human terms. 37,000 people had gone about their lives, some aware of the threat, most not, while 33 minutes of violence at Tessavaan Drift removed the possibility of the thing that had been coming for them. Sale had been standing in his cockpit thinking about docking clamps. The INS Warden's commitment had been pulling Caelari frigate positions at 16,000 kilometers. These two things had been occurring simultaneously, in the same universe, separated by 12 light minutes and every possible experiential gulf. Alden wrote in her working notes, "The station's inhabitants are not incidental context for the engagement. They are its object. The 14th Meridian Fleet did not fight a battle. It stood between a threat and 37,000 people, by accident, for 33 minutes, and the accident was in the arrival. None of the standing was accidental." She kept those notes separate from her formal record, but she kept them. The record itself was not straightforward to assemble. Alden had been warned before she departed for Tessavaan that the Historical Oversight Office's request for a survey would face institutional friction. The warning had come from Director Hennes Vor, her immediate superior, in the form of a brief private conversation 2 days before the ISV unfinished record departed its berth. Vor had not told her what to write. He had told her, with care and specificity, what she would likely be asked not to write, and by whom, and on what grounds. The 14th Meridian Fleet's engagement at Tessavaan had immediate diplomatic implications. The Caelari sovereignty, whatever its intentions regarding Meridian Station, had not technically been in a state of declared war with the Terran Meridian administration at the time of the engagement. The fleet's destruction had been performed by a Terran military force. That was a fact. The political interpretation of that fact was, as of Alden's departure date, still being negotiated by people considerably more senior than anyone on the ISV unfinished record. The Meridian Fleet's own command structure had been, Vor explained, enthusiastically cooperative with the Historical Oversight Office's request for a survey. Fleet Admiral Vrash had provided everything requested of him, and had offered additional materials unprompted. He had not, Vor noted, been enthusiastically cooperative with the political section of the Meridian administration, which had preferred that the engagement be described in terms that minimized its scale and implications. Vrash had declined to describe it in those terms. This had created what Vor called a clarity problem at several levels of government, and what Alden privately assessed as a problem of people preferring a comfortable account over an accurate one. She had pulled 9 Terran data buoys from the field. She had been told, 3 days into the survey, through a channel she was not supposed to know existed, that 2 of those buoys had already been flagged for administrative review, which was the institutional phrase for information whose release would be reviewed before it was incorporated into the official record. The flagging came from a political affairs office she had no direct relationship with and no authority over. She had processed those buoys on the same schedule as the others, and included their contents in her working record exactly as she would have included anything else. She had not received any order to do otherwise, and absent an explicit order, her mandate was to make the record. She had also been contacted, informally, by a liaison from the Caelari sovereignty's new provisional diplomatic mission. The sovereignty, following the engagement, was in the process of the kind of internal reorganization that happens to institutions after they sustain losses of that magnitude. The provisional mission was attempting to establish what had actually occurred at Tessavaan, which had placed it in the unusual position of being broadly aligned with Alden's own project. The liaison had requested access to her Caelari core reconstructions. She had declined, explaining that her mandate was to produce a record for the Meridian Fleet Historical Oversight Office, and that the sovereignty's own diplomatic mission was free to pursue its own parallel inquiry. The liaison had thanked her and not pressed the point. She had kept a private log throughout the survey, separate from the formal record, noting each instance where her access to materials was complicated or where information she requested moved more slowly than the materials she had not specifically requested. The pattern was consistent. Data that supported a complex, large-scale picture of the engagement moved slowly. Data that could be incorporated into a minimized account moved readily. She had not written this observation into her formal record, because it was an observation about the record-making process rather than about the engagement itself. She kept it because she intended to know it, and because she thought that the people who would read her work decades hence would benefit from knowing that the record had been contested at the point of its creation. She thought about Kes Voren, who had checked her sensors 3 times before she trusted what she was seeing. Alden had checked her institutional context 3 times as well and arrived at the same conclusion. The instruments were functioning correctly. The problem was that the reading was simply too large for the available frameworks. Technician Moravelle had raised the issue with her directly on the evening of the 5th day. They had been reviewing the final casualty figures together: 2,347 Caelari hulls, 620 Terran dead, 37,000 station residents alive, and Vel had set down her coffee and looked at the numbers for a long moment. "There's going to be pressure to write this smaller," Vel had said. "Yes." "Are you going to resist it?" Alden had considered this. "I'm going to write what the field shows. If what the field shows is large, the record will be large. My mandate is accuracy." Vel had nodded and picked up her coffee again. They had gone back to the figures. The formal record had taken Alden 8 days to produce after she completed the survey. It ran to 417 pages, not counting appendices. It was accurate. It was also, she was relatively confident, the largest engagement record in Meridian Fleet's operational history, measured by the ratio of forces engaged. She filed it without annotation on the contested materials, because the formal record was not the place for annotation about the record-making process, and because what mattered most was that the record existed, in its complete form, independent of the interpretive pressures that had tried to shape it. The private log went into her personal archive. She expected it to remain there. She did not expect this expectation to be correct, but she held it anyway. On the 6th day, she went to the Irreversible herself. The duty officer who met her at the airlock was a young lieutenant who had the expression of someone who had been through something they would be processing for the rest of their life. She asked him where Fleet Admiral Vrash was. He led her to the ship's main observation deck, a long, curved room with reinforced glass panels looking out at the debris field. Vrash was standing at one of the panels, looking out. He was older than his file photo suggested, or perhaps the file photo was simply from before this month. He turned when she entered and looked at her with the eyes of a man who had filed a report that did not adequately describe what had happened, and knew it. "Survey Commander." "Admiral." She stopped beside him and looked out at the field. 900 kilometers of broken Caelari metal drifting in its geometric sectors. "I've been reading the cores. 43 Caelari, 9 of your data buoys. I've interviewed several of your people. I think I have the sequence." And she considered what to say. She had the sequence. She had the numbers. 2,347 hulls destroyed or hulked. 211 escaped. 11 Terran ships lost, 31 more with significant damage, 620 Terran casualties confirmed. 37,000 people on Meridian Station who were still alive. 33 minutes and 35 seconds of engagement time. "I can describe every step of what happened," she said finally. "I can tell you the timestamp of every significant event, the weight of fire per minute, the sequence of the capital ship kills. I can give you a document that any military analyst in human space could read and follow." Vrash was quiet for a moment, but I don't think that document will explain it. She paused, finding the right words. The numbers are correct. The sequence is correct. The tactical logic is internally consistent once you accept the premise. The premise is the part I keep stopping at. The premise that 84 ships, your fleet, which arrived by accident, at a location you didn't plan to be, in a formation you weren't in for combat, engaged 2,600 warships at point-blank range, and ended the engagement in 33 minutes with 37,000 civilians unharmed. Vrash looked out at the field. A piece of Caelari hull plating, perhaps 20 meters across, drifted past the observation windows at a leisurely rate. We had the initiative, he said. Yes. They weren't ready. No. The cascade put us inside their formation perimeter, which meant their command structure was severed from its flanking units before they'd established a coherent command posture. Our targeting AI had solutions before they'd finished identifying us. We had shields up from the transit stress protocols. They were in standby. Yes, Alden said. I know all of that. I've documented all of that. It's all true. She stopped speaking for a moment. Out in the field, the debris drifted in its sectors, patient and cold. A long way out, she could see the faint glimmer of a Caelari hull section rotating slowly on its long axis, a piece of something larger that had been reduced to this tumbling remnant. I keep thinking about Fleet Sovereign Dorn, she said. He was a meticulous commander. I've read his pre-engagement assessments. He had planned for contingencies. He had identified every realistic risk to his operation and built responses to them. She looked at the drifting wreckage. He had not planned for this because this wasn't a realistic risk. No rational military analysis of the Tessavaan region, on the day he departed for it, would have flagged the possibility that the 14th Meridian Fleet would arrive accidentally, by drive malfunction, at the precise moment and location that maximized their tactical advantage. Vrash was quiet. But here is what I find myself thinking about, she continued. The 14th Meridian Fleet arrived by accident. That's what the technical record shows. The cascade inversion brought you here without intent, without planning, without any tactical decision made in advance. And yet, she gestured at the field. The AI network processed 2,600 contacts without hitting a performance ceiling. Your crews worked their stations for 33 minutes without a coordination failure. Your ship absorbed direct fire from a fleet of this size and held together. None of that was an accident. None of that was luck. That was the 14th Meridian Fleet being exactly what it is, doing what it was built to do, at a scale nobody had previously measured it against. She turned to look at the Admiral. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, not discomfort, not pride, something quieter than either. The accident brought you here, she said. What happened after the accident was not an accident at all. Vrash looked back at the field for a long moment. Then he said quietly, We lost 11 ships. Yes. 620 people. Yes. That is not a result that calls for satisfaction. No, she agreed. It isn't, and I won't record it as one. She was quiet for a moment. But I will record what the field shows, because the field shows something that matters for the record of what humanity has built out here, whether or not it calls for satisfaction. He didn't answer that. She hadn't expected him to. She asked him one more question before she left. She asked what he had thought, in the moment after the cascade inversion, when his tactical officer's report came in, and he understood what he was looking at. What had passed through his mind in those 8 seconds between receiving the contact data and issuing his first order? Vrash was quiet for long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, still looking out at the field, I thought we are in the wrong place, and then I looked at the contacts and I thought, but someone needed us here. He paused. And then I thought, report, because after that there wasn't time to think anything else. There was only the work. She wrote it down. She wrote all of it down. The ISV unfinished record departed Tessavaan Drift 11 days after it arrived, with 43 Caelari hull memory cores catalogued, 9 Terran data buoys preserved, 417 pages of formal record filed, and one survey commander who sat in her cabin on the first night of transit and read back through her working notes in the manner of someone who had looked at something very large and needed to understand what she had seen. The debris field would drift for centuries before it dispersed. Tessavaan's geometry would remain in the data, patient as the cold, those clean sectors, those methodical gaps, the specific and organized thoroughness of a force that had arrived without intention and performed with precision. The record would stand. That was what she had come to ensure. That was what she had done. There was one last thing she did before she closed the survey file. She pulled the memorial record she had been building alongside the tactical one, the data buoy of Captain Aren Soam, the addendum from Lieutenant Commander Akafer about the survival pods, the account of the tug operator standing in his cockpit watching a number on a navigation screen. These were not tactical documents. They did not belong in the formal record, which had a specific scope and did not accommodate the kind of material that resisted categorization. She had gathered them anyway, in the way that a survey commander who has worked wreck sites for 11 years gathers things that the mission specification does not explicitly request, but that the work clearly requires. She compiled them into a separate file and gave it a heading: Tessavaan Drift, Supplementary Accounts and Witness Testimonies. It was not a formal submission. She filed it alongside the primary record as an annex, noting in the cover entry that its contents were not required reading for the tactical reconstruction, but that any future analyst who wanted to understand the engagement's meaning rather than merely its mechanics would find the annex more useful than the primary record. She thought about Vrash at the observation window. She thought about Oris working through the cruiser cluster without being told to. She thought about Akafer going back to Cap 11 for the pods. She thought about Sale standing in his cockpit looking at a number that meant nothing and everything. The 14th Meridian Fleet was already gone by the time the survey concluded, returned to its operational area, dispersed to repair facilities and crew rotations, the ships that still existed becoming again the tools they had always been, waiting for the next assignment. The Irreversible had departed Tessavaan on the survey's 9th day, its engines carrying it away from the field it had helped create. Alden had watched it go from the ISV unfinished record's own observation bay, its dark hull shrinking against the star field until it was indistinguishable from the debris around it, and then distinguishable again by the quality of its movement, purposeful, directed, the motion of a thing that knew where it was going. That was the thing about the 14th Meridian Fleet, she decided. It had not known where it was going at 14:07:33. It had arrived wrong, displaced in the middle of something it had not sought, and it had known anyway exactly what to do. That was not the accident, that was the fleet. That was what had been built, over years of training and doctrine and the quiet accumulation of professional readiness, until it was a thing that could be dropped into any situation, even the wrong situation, even the impossible situation, and perform. She closed the survey file. She marked the survey complete and filed it under the heading, Tessavaan Drift Engagement Full Reconstruction, and she left it to be read by whoever came after her, in whatever time they found themselves in, looking back at 33 minutes that had hung on the edge of a catastrophe that did not happen, and trying to understand, as she had tried to understand, the difference between what arrives by accident and what is done on purpose. The field drifted, the record existed, that was enough.